at least virtually. Okay, now I have to behave myself. Uh, so as Hubert said, feel free to interrupt with questions or clarification, but I'll make sure that whatever else I'm doing, I make sure I leave 20 minutes or more at the end for discussion. So we're already kind of into the hour, so I better get moving. All right. Oh, also I have oops, I got to get this advance working. A lot of topics, a lot of this stuff, because you have been focused on this area, as so many people have, I'm sure before the course and have had other speakers, I'm going to just skip over a lot of these introductory slides, but I included them for any backfill or just reminding yourself of stuff that you need. So when we go through this first bunch of slides, we're going to blow through a lot of them very quickly. I'll stop on a couple that I just want to emphasize. I'm going to add a few references and a little cleanup and share them with Hubert later today. And I think by tomorrow, he'll be able to actually provide you with the slides so that you can look them over at your leisure. We're going to focus, sort of more on this latter part of mitigation and adaptation. Okay. All right, so yeah, I already said I'm going to skip a lot of slides. Also, when you get the PowerPoint, when you look in the notes below the slides, you'll find links to sources, and in some of them, comments or discussion. I haven't had time to fill them all in. So, we don't need to elaborate on this. There's a lot of concern. There are some people who still think this is a hoax. That's dwindling, but among economists, you'll be pleased to hear, and I'm not sure how many of you have an economics background, it's sort of near unanimous that this is an issue. It's something that economists of every stripe are focused on now. So a little bit of perspective. I've also been doing a lot of work lately on COVID and how it's affecting cities and housing and other real estate markets. But this is from a slide I did before the pandemic about some of the issues and risks that we face in cities. What a surprise. I had climate change in the list. I might have put it first, but I didn't. But I was very proud that I put down pandemic before the COVID emerged, even though it was the last slide and I didn't say too much about it in the presentation. But again, we have a lot of things. There are also interactions between climate change and the pandemic, and also the geopolitical risks. I've also been focused lately on for some classes elsewhere on effects that the war in Ukraine may have on real estate markets and housing markets in Ukraine, but also around the world. So all this stuff ties together, but we're going to just look at some partial things. So, when I was doing work on COVID, I would always put this slide up and say, don't forget, we have these other things that are, COVID's going to get tamped down, but this is still something we'll be concerned about. But I'm a fairly optimistic person. Boy, there was a Freudian slip. Here I am thinking about COVID, the war in Ukraine, climate change. How do I sleep at night? Well, because when you look at a lot of indicators, and some of you, in fact, I'll bet all of you know about this tremendous resource, World in Data, that the German economist Roser has put together, Max Roser. These are just some, how some of the basic indicators of human well-being have improved over, certainly over my lifetime, which generally starts around here. So the last third of these pictures. Okay. I'm not going to talk about Thomas Malthus. I'm assuming you probably all know about him and his various followers, including, if any of you watch Marvel movies, the well-known Marvel Malthusian Thanos, but we'll sort of skip over this. ironic thing about Malthus is when he wrote his famous work, before he wrote it, up until about the time he wrote it, the Malthusian model was a pretty good description of the world. And Malthus wrote his books just about the time Malthusian models got thrown out the window by the second agricultural revolution and the industrial revolution and all these other things that sort of happened. But it's a fair question whether we could end up in another Malthusian trap, partly due to climate. So, just because Malthus was right for thousands of years, then he was wrong for a couple hundred. And, we should ask ourselves, what about the next couple hundred? Two slides I will touch on, this one in particular. Why are so few economists, why have we kind of resisted the Malthusian story, about declining resources, the sort of Club of Rome models, if you are familiar with those and the like? It's two things. One is that when something starts to get into a shortage, its relative price changes, and then people start to substitute away from that. So if one, classic case, if beef gets more expensive, people eat less beef and more chicken, or, you have many examples you can give. Another is endogenous technical change. When the price of something starts to go up, people start to work harder at technical change about how we might get the same output from less of that particular thing. What's different about carbon and other greenhouse gases, as you all know, is these things aren't priced. And when they're not priced, these things don't work well unless, at least they don't work well in a market context. The private market isn't going to do much to solve problems using these powerful tools, if you like, whenever things aren't priced. And that's why global warming and greenhouse gas emissions are such a wicked hard problem. This is other stuff that Malthus didn't foresee, but we'll kind of get into that. I just want to sort of note, there are lots of other urban environmental problems we could talk about, including water and sanitation, something I spent a lot of time on and still do in my, especially in my international work in emerging markets. And so, again, we're going to have our hands full just talking about climate change today, but I wanted to note this. Some of you may have been familiar with so-called Kuznets, environmental Kuznets curves. There's a lot of debate. No one believes that this picture is an accurate numerical representation. It came out in '92, and it turns out that while these pictures are qualitatively representative, the numbers change depending on the country, the time, the context. But it is true, as cities and countries develop, including but not limited to more GDP or more income, some things like water and sanitation unambiguously get better. Some things get worse and then get better. If you're living in a subsistence economy, you don't emit a lot of sulfur dioxide. As you industrialize, you do. And then as people grapple with the problems, you kind of reduce it. But some things like solid waste, but also greenhouse gases, those are the problems that the market's not going to solve because they're not priced. Okay, well, this is just about some of the other problems, but we'll skip over them. By the way, some kinds of air pollution aren't priced. I'm from Pennsylvania and grew up visiting family in Pittsburgh during the 50s, whenever Pittsburgh looked not quite this bad, but pretty bad. And so even though markets won't solve the problem, governments will quickly take action, or not quickly, but in historical time, because everybody suffers from particulates. I don't know if anybody's spent a lot of time in China. I haven't been able to get in recently. I don't know about you, but I don't know if we have any Chinese colleagues on the call. But basically, China, even 15 years ago, a dozen years ago, had terrible problems, still has issues, but they've improved the air around Beijing and Shanghai. Why? Because everybody suffers from that, even the elites. If you're interested in China's environmental problems, I recommend my colleague Siqi Zheng's work. I'll tell you more about her at the end if we have time. So, all right. So this is just some info about different kinds of air pollution. Climate change basics. I'm going to skip some of these definitions. Mitigation and adaptation. I'm assuming everybody's heard this before, but basically mitigation is we're going to do things to stop or reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases and whatever else we can do to stop climate change, to stop the global warming behind it. Adaptation is we're going to face up to and adapt to the circumstances that fall from it. Dirty little secret, we need to do both. People will still argue, there's still broad debates about the mix of mitigation and adaptation. Over time, I've become leaning more towards adaptation for a simple reason is we already have so many greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that aren't going to go away, and we're not doing a very good job of reducing emissions to targets. So I think we're basically going to be faced with, there's just no getting away from it in my view, some real serious issues, and we have to think about adaptation. That doesn't mean we give up on mitigation. It means that we kind of face reality. That's my view, and we might, others may have a different view. We can discuss that in a few minutes. All right, I'm going to these are just some pictures you've all seen of, what's happening to the climate. I'm going to talk a lot about carbon. I'm going to use carbon as shorthand. Carbon is, as I'm sure you all know, per molecule, not the worst greenhouse gas in terms of its effect, but there's a lot of it, and it lasts in the atmosphere a long time. Recently, there's been a lot more discussion of methane, and for good reason, but methane, there's less of it, and it doesn't stay in the atmosphere as long. That doesn't mean we're not concerned. I'm very concerned about methane, but we're going to talk a lot about carbon. Sometimes carbon is going to be loosely a shorthand for greenhouse gases because it's fewer syllables, but also we often have better data. Better doesn't mean great, but better data on carbon than we do on other greenhouse gases. By the way, we all love the greenhouse effect because without it, the Earth would be utterly uninhabitable by carbon-based life forms, including us. You have to have some greenhouse effect for our climate to be livable with our biology, but you can have too much of a good thing. This is a chart you've probably seen before from the World Resources Institute, and this shows that depending on how you cut it, I mean, virtually all of these sources, transportation, electricity and heat, buildings, manufacturing, industrial processes are all connected to cities. Even agriculture, cities provide a lot of the derived demand for agriculture. So a lot of greenhouse gases are emitted because of various urban activities. Of course, there are residential buildings in rural areas, but increasingly, now that roughly 60% of the world's population before long live in cities, depending on data and definitions, most of this is happening in cities these days. I'm going to sort of skip through some of these things. that you've seen before. I had this one thing, I don't know if you knew this. I always I had never stopped to think, why is there so much damn carbon in the air? And especially, from hydrocarbons. And then I sort of, the light bulb went off when I read a little bit about the chemistry. And, the idea is take gasoline, about 5 out of the 6 pounds in a gallon of gasoline, a little bit less than 4 liters, is carbon, but carbon dioxide is carbon and oxygen combined together from the atmosphere. And so the carbon that escapes bonds with 2 heavier molecules from the atmosphere. So a gallon of gasoline yields about 19 pounds of carbon dioxide, which kind of helps me think about this. I'm going to skip over stuff you've seen before. Because we our time is short. We want to have discussion. Things are lots of issues, not just sea level rise, but all sorts of climatic issues, drought. Places become hard to live in just because of high heat. Economists have estimated what global warming would do to GDP. This is from Matt Kahn and colleagues. The first slide is their forecasts, and these are model results. These are kind of what ifs, not forecasts anybody would bet their pension on, or in fact, I don't think I'd bet my lunch money on them. But it just gives you some qualitative idea that if we stick to the agreed upon objectives, we're still going to see declines in GDP from what we have in the absence of additional global warming. But if we don't do anything, we're going to see a lot of places that are going to have 15, 16% lower GDPs. Now you might say, well, so what? Well, here's the thing. Generally, the distribution of those losses or foregone growth aren't evenly distributed. And I'll be blunt. I suspect most of the people on this call are highly educated in working in or linked to developed countries. We're not the ones that are going to bear the bulk of this burden. Okay, a little bit about changes in views on this. I'm going to sort of skip over this, but I have a lecture that's online if you want to watch it on some of the issues involved in urban economics that are going to feed into our discussion. But given the time and the fact that we want to have discussion, I'm going to basically skip over some of this stuff, even though I hate to do it because it fascinates me, but about cities. And let's get to the, in fact, let's even skip this. Let's get to mitigation and adaptation, which I think are the key things. All right, mitigation, we're going to stop the dominoes from falling, or at least slow that down. If you're interested in the economics of this, I recommend the best point of entry is a book by Bill Nordhaus on climate mitigation, including carbon pricing. His book, Climate Casino, is a great read and a great introduction and beyond introduction. It's now about 8 or 9 years old. He has a more recent paper that has updated some of this, and I'll put the links to that paper in the slides before I post it. And there are a couple of ways that you can, mitigate taxes and subsidies, cap and trade systems, and just new technologies which can be introduced and sometimes mandated. I'm not going to spend time on these numbers. I want to kind of get to, I'm going to assume that given that you've had 12 meetings before this, and all of you are a selected sample of people who I presume are interested in climate, they're kind of familiar with carbon taxes, cap and trade, command and control regulation. I've got to fix this. Not this one for once is not my mistake. I got this slide about economists' views of carbon taxes versus cap and trade and why from the web, from a source I've been to many times. And then I noticed these numbers don't add up to 100%. And so I've emailed the Booth School, what in the world's going on. So if they get back to me, I'll hope to fix this. But a basic story is most economists prefer carbon taxes to cap and trade for several reasons. One of which is cap and trade, which you have. We have quite a few of these systems out there. They're complicated, and their distributional effects are sometimes bizarre. I want to spend a little more time on adaptation, which is frankly talked about less in the literature. So here's my little whimsical adaptation. Best introduction to that I know is from another colleague, Matt Kahn, now at USC, who's written on this extensively. A very good introduction is his book, a very quick read too, Adapting to Climate Change. I'll just reveal, Matt's a little more sanguine about how likely various adaptation measures are going to occur than I am. I'm a little bit more, these are going to be hard and costly. He's a little bit more, we'll take care of it. But it's a great counterpart to read the Nordhaus and Kahn books together. You'll kind of get a good grasp of how economists are viewing this. So adaptation, lots of ways to adapt. Let me sort of skip ahead. Oftentimes, the first thing we think of in adaptation, anybody here from the Netherlands? Was that a yes?
Yeah, we have quite a few people from the Netherlands. I don't know if they're here.
Yeah, me too.
So now one of
We're not
Netherlands.
Dutch. We're just based in the Netherlands.
Oh, okay. Well, actually, I started worrying about climate change in the mid 1980s. I don't claim that makes me special. I just happen to have two friends who were worried about it at the time, and they got me thinking about it. And one of them was a friend from, surprise, the Netherlands, and the other was from, see if anyone, 10 seconds, if anyone can guess, I'll give you a hint. This person came from the country of my forebears, but you got to guess the city. And I'll give you a hint. The name of the city starts with a V.
Venice.
Venice. So in the mid 80s, my friends who were already concerned about climate change came from Venice and the Netherlands. Coincidence? I think not. So anyway, adaptation, we think about this infrastructure and not without reason, but that's sort of like the poster child for adaptation. There are lots of other things that are, kind of less sexy. Going the other direction, this one's a little bit well known. Here's a form of adaptation, famous if you work in developing countries. Bangladesh has a lot of people who used to make livings raising chickens. Bangladesh is very much subject to flooding that's getting worse for a whole bunch of environmental reasons, including climate change, as well as deforestation and other things. And so these people who are not rich, but have a bunch of chickens, find that the flood kills the chickens. And scratching head, and then it's suddenly, well, how about if we switch to ducks? So adaptation, let's build some huge multi-billion dollar infrastructure that might work hopefully will, has worked for a while in the Netherlands. Or let's raise ducks instead of chickens. I mean, I think that sort of encapsulates the range. I see some things in the chat. Let me see if
No, Steve, it's
Oh,
just comments. It's just
okay.
comments now.
all right, okay. So Hubert, if there's a question I should stop in the chat, let me know, just interrupt. Okay. So here's some lists of the kinds of things that we can do in cities. The other thing is, when you're focused on cities per se, mitigation in cities, if my home city of Boston basically institutes a carbon tax, well, that would be nice, but it's not going to have a huge effect on global warming, and it's not going to have a huge effect on the challenges that Boston faces, because our climatic changes, at least with respect to climate change, aren't driven by our own local emissions. But we can do things locally on the adaptation side. And this is just a partial list. You can probably, in fact, I would be very grateful for other ideas about things that we should add to the list. I'll sort of go over a few of these slides, and then we'll get some discussion going. And then ex post adaptation is, what you do after the event. How do you deliver emergency services? How do you provide water and food? How do you evacuate? So again, and also housing comes in to the fold here. And in fact, sometimes the line is blurred between ex ante and ex post, or proactive and reactive. So for example, I told you I do a lot of work on housing policy. And one theme of a lot of housing economists that we could talk about, if you like, is if you're going to subsidize housing for low-income people, for example, then it's often better to do that with some kind of housing allowance or housing benefit or housing voucher, different terms of art in different countries, than it is to get focused on, bricks and mortar subsidies that tie people to particular places. The allowances should be themselves portable and not tied to a particular city or location. And also, I just mentioned there's a lot of interest in talking about rent controls given rising rents and affordability problems. One of the problems is there's a lot of research. In fact, one of the most clearly documented negative impacts of controls is that they reduce household mobility, which can affect labor markets, but also can limit people's adaptation if that involves changing homes. And these are some steps that cities in particular could take, although a lot of adaptation isn't just the province of governments, it's also the province of firms, individual households, and sometimes combinations of those. Cities in particular need to focus on how robust or resilient key infrastructure is, and some of the future infrastructure. Some of the adjustment will be migration from one part of the city to another, to higher ground, if you like. Some will be from one location, from the coastline to the interior of a country, and some will be international. And there's a lot of discussion recently of international migration that's stimulated by climate. Sort of two things to hold in your head at once. There's certainly going to be climate change stimulated migration, but there's often a lot less such migration than we would want to see if we expected migration to solve the problems. If you're thinking, as some people have, that, well, Bangladesh is going to be really at risk. It's a large, very dense country with a lot of people kind of like Holland before the dikes, and it can't afford to build the dikes, or at least hasn't, or does not. Also, given their geography, you couldn't build the dikes because of the way the deltas are designed or exist. Well, they can just move somewhere else. People move, and that creates problems, for cities and countries that are concerned with the aftermath of large migrations. But those large migrations, everything's relative. Most people don't leave. There's been lots of studies of places that all around the world that disasters hit, and everyone knows it's going to happen again, but people move back. A lot of people move back. So this migration is, this is why I'm a little bit, I think my friend Matt is a little more sanguine about long run migration being a large part of the solution than I am. So yeah, that's kind of what. And we have to think about technologies that and how they work and how they interact. So, for example, this is from my friend Alain Berthaud, a chart that shows the emissions from different transportation systems. One thing in the US we have some of the filthiest transit systems in the world. If you think you're going to solve global warming by getting on a New York City bus, you've never sort of stood behind a New York City bus in traffic. It's diesel. It's particularly dirty diesel. They're converting, but kind of slowly. Electric vehicles are going to vary a lot depending on where the electricity comes from. So if you're in, say, France, where most power comes from nuclear, or Sweden, I believe it's a lot of nuclear and geothermal and hydropower. That's a great solution. But if you're in Poland, where they basically burn some of the dirtiest coal in the world to generate electricity, you're not really gaining anything by moving to a car, unless your other option is to drive a Cadillac SUV, which I don't recommend. Let me sort of stop there. I have some other material, but we've gone over a lot, and let's get some discussion going, and questions, comments, your ideas about mitigation versus adaptation. Actually, and again, let me emphasize this. There's a lot of debate that sounds like we do one or the other. We're going to have to do both. The question is, what's our portfolio look like, and what are we going to, how are we going to do the adaptation, and how are we going to do it efficiently and equitably? So let me stop there. And Hubert, how do we usually get the ball rolling on the discussion?
So first, thanks, Steve. So usually, emerging leaders raise their hand to virtually to ask a question. Just before, I was wondering, would you have maybe in your slides or in mind an example of like kind of urban economics policy that have been used by a city to tackle climate change in terms of adaptation or mitigation?
Well, again, it depends on how you define an urban policy, but let me back up.
Just because I think it could be, this element could be also super relevant regarding the previous lecture, because it was mentioned several times, and then we will obviously start the Q&A session with the.
Sorry, what was mentioned several times?
Like the importance to have a kind of holistic approach and policy, climate policy to tackle climate change at a more like systemic level.
Well, I think one of the urban policies, that we have is urban economists have done a lot of work that I haven't discussed in detail on the pricing of insurance and how mispricing insurance for real estate, including people's housing, incentivizes people to build in vulnerable places, not just with respect to coastlines, but mudslides and other precarious locations. So a lot of urban economics literature has basically argued for organizing a better system of explicit and implicit insurance. The implicit insurance is the idea that even if I don't have insurance, if I believe the government is going to come in and make me whole, and it's a tough thing to do, once people have been hit by a climate-related disaster or another kind of disaster, you need to, of course, apply immediate relief measures, but then what happens next is the issue. So research that we've done on insurance, but also on regulations, the way we zone or plan in Europe, planning it has a lot more teeth in it, compared to the US, where we use what's called Euclidean zoning more. So that literature is a strong one. There's a lot of research on how housing costs, affordability, have been adversely affected in the US, but also around the world. I can name some references and put some in the revised slides. Let me just make a note. But regulation is not like some homogeneous thing that you have a little of or a lot. It's more like the analogy I use, and for undergrads is it's not like playing with the sand at the beach where all the sand is just the same, and you just use more or less of it when you build your sandcastle. It's more like putting together Lego, and if you're missing that one piece, the damn thing isn't going to look right. And so getting the right kinds of regulations. So, for example, regulations that affect locations and basic security, aspects of building codes and so on, that passed a cost benefit test. Haven't talked much about cost benefit. I'm happy to do that if you like. But those are examples of things that urban economists have argued need to be. In other words, here's one problem that we have around the world, not just in the US. Whenever you have somebody build something near somebody else, there are all sorts of incentives, for some people to put a blockade in that, what we sometimes call NIMBY, not in my backyard. But on the other hand, NIMBYs don't worry about fire codes. So example from my country, a big fire in Oakland, California, where as it happens, my son and one of my sons and his family live, killed a large number of people. Nobody was worried about enforcing the fire code because it wasn't impacting the neighbors. On the same time, part of the homeless problem in Oakland, only part, is connected to the fact that it's very hard to get new multifamily housing built, even within the city. Now, you might say, well, that's the US. Well, look at the Grenfell fire in the UK. Again, that's another one where the right kinds of regulations weren't enforced. So a lot of urban economists, I'm going to put something in about that, focus on doing the cost benefit of specific regulations. That's something that Lamberto has worked on a lot. What kinds of regulations make the city safer, more resilient to not just climate change, but other problems? Which kinds are more have more perverse effects? I don't know if that helps or.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Steve. So yes, let's start the Q&A session. If you have any questions you would like to ask, feel free to virtually raise your hand. It can also be maybe if you need more details concerning urban economics concept. So yeah.
And Hubert, if I miss somebody's hand because I've got my screen full of this slide, please make sure I call on everybody.
Sure, I will. I'm on it.
A raised hand.
Yes, Flaminia.
Hello, hi Steven. Thank you very much for the presentation. So I'm Flaminia. I'm an economist by background, but I work now as an ESG officer in a Belgian REIT that works in the healthcare sector. But I'm personally interested very much in the residential sector and everything related to housings and the relationship with climate. So in particular REITs, but in general, the European regulation is putting a lot of stress on companies in order to tackle climate risks, both transitional risks and physical risks. And currently we see companies, the company I work for, also working on not only climate risk analysis, but also developing investment plans in order to kind of face these risks and have a strategy for adapting or mitigating risk, or both, as you suggested. Most of these investment plans combine insurance plans, but also investments in the buildings, in the building stocks, for being sure that buildings are able to face the consequences and the impact of, for example, physical risks. What I always ask myself is, in the end, we kind of expect who is the one that bears the end cost of this, because companies need to have a return for their investment, and especially in the residential sector. What I always thought and asked, but never really found a concrete answer, is whether, for example, the renovation of building stock in order to face, for example, transition risk and reduction targets of carbon emission can lead to an appreciation of properties that in the end is bared by occupants. So this would in the end, yes, increase property values, but increase rent, and at the end, how can I say, like exacerbate the difference between building users, between classes in a city. So I don't know if you ever encountered this kind of questions in your experience, but I think it's an important topic, and I think that sometimes policies, at least at European level, we see that in the Green Deal, one of the let's say one of the expectation is of course to avoid any increase in segregation in cities, but there is not practical action point in the future in the policies that there is. So I was wondering if yes.
I think you put your finger on a very important element of the emerging research agenda, which that's a quick way of saying, gee, I wish I knew the answer to that very solidly, because we're still figuring that out. There's been a lot of debate and research in recent years, though not enough, about whether various of these kinds of activities are reflected in property values and allow the REIT or developer or whatever, whoever, where the we talk in economics, we talk about the legal incidence of a tax or regulation and the economic incidence. So in a market where people value the innovation that in this case a better design, or however we want to frame it, then the REIT or whoever the investor is gets a return on that. If if they don't value it, but there's a social need for it, then there's the question of who ends up paying, the supplier or the consumer. The consumer can be a household or a firm in this case.
Yes.
And that depends on supply elasticity, and we can go. So where am I going with this? It's an important question. It's a complicated one. I put in the name of one of my friends who works out of the Netherlands. It seems like everyone who works in, not everyone, many people working in this area have some connection there. And you may know his work if you've been working in this area, but if not, you should check him out. So the short answer is, we're still sorting this out. There are some things that we do, various certification for green buildings and so on, that there's a lot of debate about whether they really have an impact on the environment or whether it's greenwashing. I'm sure you know that term.
Yes.
And again, that's another hotly debated issue. So, I think we still have a lot to learn on this.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you.
Benjamin, you have a question?
Yes. Hello. So yeah, thank you so much for this presentation. My name is Benjamin. I'm a postgrad student on local economic development at the London School of Economics. And I had a question on, because you talked about the market not being able to price climate change. So I was wondering what reasons do you see behind this? And also because I was also wondering whether or not actually urban economics was able to shift from a perspective studying, for example, urban agglomerations, economy, technologies, spillovers, and so on from a GDP and outcomes perspective to a more what kind of climate change or CO2 outcomes can we expect from like those agglomeration effect and all those kind of urban economics modeling? If that makes sense to you. So
there's a lot I've heard you say, and I'm not sure I can frame all of it in questions that I can, attack briefly, but a couple of thoughts. The pricing issue, is simply that, the world is full of things that are important that aren't priced. And, when you take your first economics course, this gets kind of glossed over sometimes. So every economist I know, no matter where they would put themselves on an, if you want, ideological or other spectrum, will in the end say there's some things that aren't priced that are, have external costs and external benefits and other market failures. And we need to do something about them as a society, and government is often the instrument we use to do that. We have other instruments, voluntary associations and the like. But every economist also agrees that we have government failures where governments don't take the right approach to a problem and may do more harm than good. Where all the debates are is, where are the externalities and what are the things that we can do that would be effective? And so that puts a very, it puts a lot of burden on the government officials, if we focus on them for the moment, or politicians or however we're framing that, to kind of know a lot about how the market works, how specifically it's failing, and what we can do that will actually work in practice instead of simply in theory, or, it'll make us feel good to put this in place, even if it's ineffective. And so that's why, so many economists focus on, carbon taxes, because, the research that we do, theory and empirics, shows that those are often the best way forward. In terms of, I think something else that is built into your comments and your questions are, we often talk first about, economists often talk first about efficiency, but we also, have to be concerned with distribution, how the costs and benefits are shared, and fairness, which is related to, but a little bit different. I often tell my students, I don't know how many people in the group are economists, and I'll bet we have some engineers too. And here's a dirty little secret. The only people in the world who get excited about efficiency are economists and engineers. No one else cares about efficiency. Well, it's okay, but you don't get excited about it. What really drives people are issues of equity and fairness. And there's I'll just argue and can talk about it later. I can incorporate some slides in the new deck. I think economists have more to say about these issues. Sometimes we're our own worst messengers at, not being clear about, how we frame those equity issues, which come up a lot in climate change in particular. I know that's a little bit rambling, but let me stop and get some other questions.
Hello, I hope you can hear me. Super interesting lecture. Yeah, thanks for that. I'm Tabea Zonjan, and I'm basically also one of the people based in the Netherlands. I'm not Dutch, but I do a PhD here in urban health intervention stimulation. But I actually was a visiting student of Sichi Pen, Tseng. And so basically I heard that you mentioned Sichi during the lecture, and you also talked about the environmental Kuznets curve. And I think it's also maybe actually an elegant continuation about the inequity debate that you just hinted at. My question is basically, so Sichi always pushes this point that if you don't address pollution in all places at the same time, you end up with an equilibrium problem where, the pollution externalities from the rich are just allocated to poor places. Right. And so the issue is that, we're in a very unequal world, and basically one of the policy interventions that I've been following, and I'm really happy to see being implemented in Europe is, for example, supply chain regulation with environmental and human rights regulation attached to all the supply chain steps of companies that are based in Europe. So do you think that has a potential to maybe addressing this issue? What other measures do you think, or economic tools do you think we have available? Because we don't have a global government as such, and even the Paris Agreement, it's not, legally binding or so. So my question is really, what do you think can address this global inequality issue of climate change impacts and causes?
I think that's a huge question, and I don't think I have an answer as much as I share your concern. I think we have. I said earlier I'm basically optimistic, and I showed some slides from Max Roser. But one of the things that I really concerned me, and I think this is what I'm hearing in yours, is we have so many problems with climate change, being maybe at the top of the list, but also pandemics, public health, where there are global spillovers, and issues of human rights and so on, where tackling these, cities can't do them on their own, countries can't do them on their own. It requires global coordination, if you want to use a term economists would use, and basically recent political events in Europe, in the US, in Asia, it seems that we're kind of in I don't think it's necessarily permanent, but we're sort of in a period where global coordination to tackle these problems is getting worse, not better. And I hope we get a turning point back up soon. We could elaborate on the details of this and some examples, but again, time is short. Let me. Sorry for not having a better answer, other than to say, nod my head and say, yeah, the global coordination, is a huge issue, and one that we're right now. I'm more, maybe I shouldn't say pessimistic. I'm less optimistic now than I was 10 years ago. I hope to be optimistic again in 10 years.
Thanks.
Another question? Or comment
Yeah,
on that?
hi everyone, and thanks Stephen for the great presentations and a lot of insights that I'm sure we need to follow up on. My question comes from the private sector because although I'm very interested in economics and I'm a trained business economist by background, I work in a startup where we apply data-driven tools for urban problems. And I wanted to ask you if you have a good reference about how to nudge neighborhoods or people in a city on a smaller level for changing their own behavior. Are there good incentives in this direction? Or what's your general opinion about this? Is this just greenwashing and we are far away from any results, or do you know any good
I'm not
developments
sure
here?
I understand exactly. Let me just ask you to clarify a little bit. When you say, matching neighborhoods, I'm not-
Nudging, sorry.
Can you give
not
an
matching.
example? Sorry?
I was meaning nudging to.
Nudging.
So, yeah.
You mean in terms of, for example, nudging them to have better building codes or change their insurance policies or improve their public health? Is that?
Well, it could start there as well, but it could start even with consumption. What do you buy in a shop? And on mobility behavior, how do you travel? Because I know that there are some initiatives, but I haven't seen any of those that are actually working and that are actually comprehensive between fields. So that's why I'm wondering if this would be a way to move forward, or we have to stick to policy and those kind of longer term procedures.
That's a good question, and one that makes me think, because I focus a lot on, what I'll call pre-nudge, mechanisms like taxes. We're changing the insurance system. And I'm sure everyone knows the sort of nudge idea, became popular with the work of a terrific economist named Richard Thaler and some colleagues. So let me punt for now and just say, climate-related nudges. I haven't thought about it, and you have. Let me see if I can come up with something before I send the revised slides out. So
Thank you.
Let me slide over to the next question. Thanks for that.
Thanks a lot, Steve. Actually, I think we're already at the end of this session. Really, thanks a lot for taking the time to answer all the questions for the fascinating lecture. Next lecture, and it will already be the last lecture of the program, will be next Friday. We'll talk about AI and urban energy system. And actually, during this lecture, we'll talk a bit about nudging. So how a nudge can be used to have a better behavior, like energical behavior. So maybe it will also answer your question, Victoria, in addition to what Steve will send. For those of you who want to stay in the room and discuss the lecture, you are more than welcome. And so for the other, we'll see next week for next Friday for the last lecture. Thanks again, Steve, really for this.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity and for the comments and questions that stimulated my thinking. If anybody does want to stay around for a few more minutes, I'd be happy to do so too, unless you want me to leave.
So, if you want to stay, you are also more than welcome, Steve. Of course.
I'll stay for a few minutes in case anybody has another question they want to throw out, even if other people have left. And then if I don't get any, I'll leave you to your
Thanks.
more important discussions, like, where we get the best coffee these days or whatever.
I actually have another question because while we went on, I thought about something you mentioned and about regulation, for example, in relation of not building in let's say more exposed area.